2:16 in the morning, Pacific time. 7 seconds passed. On November 18th, 2026, a radio command leaving Earth will need a full 24 hours to reach Voyager 1. One light day out. No object built by human hands has ever been that far. Every headline will call it a triumph. Now read the same fact a second time. From that morning onward, if something goes wrong out there, the people who built the workaround will not know for 2 days. They send, they wait, they sleep twice, then they learn whether the spacecraft is still pointed at us. Voyager has already lost its telemetry once. It has already fallen back to a transmitter nobody had touched since 1981. It is already running out of power, 4 watts of it every single year. The milestone itself is real. The celebration is the part that does not survive contact with the engineering. Here is the number underneath the timestamp. Roughly 25.9 billion kilometers, about 16 billion miles, around 170 times the distance from Earth to the Sun. It is moving at about 17 kilometers per second, which is close to 38,000 miles an hour, and it has been doing that without a single course correction since it swung past Saturn in November of 1980. Every year, it adds more than 500 million kilometers. Nothing slows it down. So the light day is not a boundary in space. There is no line out there. What crosses on November 18th is a threshold in our relationship with the machine. The project manager at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory has described it plainly. Say good morning to Voyager on a Monday at 8, and the answer arrives Wednesday at 8. That is the operational reality in one sentence. 2 days per question. 2 days per fix. 2 days to find out if the fix made things worse. And this is the claim I want to put on the table right now, because I am not going to hide it and reveal it at the end. The light day milestone is being sold as an achievement. What it actually marks is the point where the only working instrument humanity has beyond the sun's protective bubble becomes something we can barely steer, barely diagnose, and barely rescue. We have no replacement. There is not even a launch date. We are about to lose the ability to act on what we hear while we can still hear it. That is a strange kind of loss, and almost nobody is describing it that way. The delay is not the emergency. The emergency is what the delay does to every other problem the spacecraft already has. The story you have been told about Voyager is a survival story. Little probe, launched in 1987, still going. Engineers pulling off impossible saves from billions of kilometers away. It is a good story, and it is true. It is also the most misleading way to read the last 3 years. Go back to November 2023. Voyager 1 stopped making sense. The signal was still there, the carrier tone was still arriving, but the data came back as a repeating pattern of nothing. A single chip in the flight data system had failed, taking about 3% of its memory with it, and that 3% held code the spacecraft needed to package telemetry. For 5 months, nobody on Earth could read the health of the most distant machine we own. The fix in April 2024 was to break the surviving code into pieces and scatter it into whatever memory was left. That worked. Think about what it means that it had to. Then October 2024, a fault protection routine tripped while the team was turning on a heater. The spacecraft shut down its main transmitter and switched to a backup on a different frequency, one that had not been used since 1981. The team had to go looking for a signal on a channel most of them had never worked with, on hardware older than the mission's current staff. Then 2025, thrusters that had been written off as dead since 2004 were brought back to life, deliberately, because the thrusters still in use were slowly closing up. Quick question while that settles, and I mean it honestly. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it there? Because whatever the clock says on your end, Voyager's most recent word left almost a full day ago. Whatever is happening to it right now, we will not hear about until tomorrow. Now look at those 3 events as a set instead of 3 separate headlines. A memory failure, a transmitter failure, a propulsion system slowly occluding. 3 different subsystems, 3 years, 3 saves. Each one was reported as a win, because each one was a win. But the pattern underneath is not a spacecraft beating the odds. It is a spacecraft failing in more places, more often, while the time available to respond gets longer. Here is the part that should bother you. Every one of those saves depended on being able to send a command and get an answer. That capability is exactly what is degrading. And to understand why it is degrading, you have to understand something most people have never thought about at all, which is how we know Voyager is alive in the first place. We cannot see Voyager 1, not with the James Webb Space Telescope, not with Hubble, not with anything that has ever been built or seriously proposed. And the reason is worth sitting with, because it tells you exactly how thin our connection is. Voyager's main antenna is 3.5 meters across. At 25.9 billion kilometers, that dish covers an angle of roughly 300 millionths of an arc-second on the sky. Webb, at its sharpest, resolves about 700ths of an arc-second. The gap between those two numbers is around 1,000,000 to 1. You could build a telescope 1,000 times better than Webb and still not be close, and that is only the resolution problem. The brightness problem is worse because sunlight out at 170 astronomical units is nearly 30,000 times fainter than what falls on Earth, and Voyager is a small grey object with no lights on it. So the most powerful eyes humanity has ever constructed are blind to it, completely. What we have instead is a radio. Voyager transmits at roughly 23 watts. That is less than the bulb in your refrigerator. It has been broadcasting that whisper across interstellar space for almost 50 years, and by the time it reaches Earth, the power arriving is a fraction of a billionth of a billionth of a watt. To catch it, we use dishes 70 meters wide, cooled receivers, and decades of accumulated technique, and we still only barely hear it. The data trickles home slower than a 1980s modem, and it is one of the hardest routine detections in engineering. That signal is also how we know where the spacecraft is, not by looking, by listening to how the frequency shifts as it recedes, and by timing how long a ranging tone takes to go out and come back. Doppler and timing. That is the whole navigation solution. It is astonishingly precise, and it is completely dependent on the link staying up. So understand what the relationship actually is. There is no observation. There is no picture. There is no independent way to check. There is one thread of radio, 23 watts wide, and if that thread breaks, Voyager does not become lost in the sense of misplaced. It becomes lost in the sense of gone, permanently, while continuing to exist and continuing to move, and continuing to carry its golden record outward for the next several billion years, mute. We would still be able to calculate roughly where it is. We would simply never confirm anything about it again. One thread then, and on this end of that thread, on the entire planet, there is one dish. Deep Space Station 43 sits outside Canberra in Australia, 70 meters across, in service since 1973. The Deep Space Network has 3 complexes spread out around the planet, in California, in Spain, and in Australia, so that something is always facing outward as the Earth turns. Voyager can be heard from all of them. Voyager can only be commanded from one. DSS-43 is the only antenna anywhere with enough transmitting power to push a command out to the Voyagers at their current distance. Not the preferred one, the only one. Every instruction those spacecraft have received in recent years has left the planet through that single structure in the Australian bush. Now hold that next to a schedule. From May 4th, 2025 through February 2026, DSS-43 was taken offline for upgrades, 9 months. During that stretch, the mission had brief command windows in August and December, and that was it. The rest of the time, the team could listen to Voyager and could not talk to it. That is not a hypothetical. It is the reason the thruster revival happened when it did. Engineers looked at a set of thrusters that had been considered unfixable for 21 years, worked out that a disturbance had probably flipped a switch in the heater circuit, and decided to try turning them back on. The procedure carried a real risk. If the star tracker drifted off its guide star during the attempt, the spacecraft would automatically fire those cold thrusters, and firing them cold could have caused a small explosion. They did it anyway in March 2025, weeks before the dish closed, because the alternative was going into a 9-month blackout with no backup. Read that again? They accepted a chance of destroying part of the spacecraft rather than face a period where they could not reach it. And this has happened before. In 2020, DSS-43 went down for upgrades from March to October. Voyager 2 flew for 7 months with nobody able to send it a single instruction. It came through fine. Nothing went wrong, which is the only reason it reads as a success. That is the thing about single points of failure. They keep working right up until they do not, and every year they do work gets quietly filed as evidence that the arrangement is sound. I want to be precise here. This is not incompetence. Those upgrades are necessary, partly to support crewed lunar flights, and the people running the network are not careless. The situation is simply what it is. Our only instrument in interstellar space depends on one aging dish, on one continent, and on a maintenance calendar. Now add the one variable nobody can engineer around. 4 watts a year. That is the number that matters most, and it sounds like nothing at all. Voyager's power comes from plutonium-238 decaying inside 3 generators, converting heat directly into electricity. There is no fuel to add and no way to slow it. At launch, the system produced around 470 watts. Today, it is somewhere near half of that and falling by roughly 4 watts every year, which is about the draw of a small nightlight. Lose 1 nightlight a year from a 50-year-old machine. Put that way, it sounds survivable. It is not, and the reason is that decline like this does not end gradually. It ends at a threshold. Here is what the budget actually looks like. Voyager has to keep instruments running, and it has to keep heaters running, because interstellar space is around 270 degrees below 0 Celsius, and hydrazine lines freeze. Every watt spent on warmth is a watt not spent on science, and every watt spent on science is a watt not spent keeping the plumbing liquid. The team has been resolving that conflict for decades by switching things off in a carefully chosen order. The cosmic ray subsystem went dark in February 2025. The low-energy charged particle instrument followed in April 2026. By that point, NASA's own status table listed exactly 2 working science instruments on Voyager 1, the magnetometer and the plasma wave subsystem. 2 out of the 11 it launched with. 9 retirements, and each one was a decision somebody had to make about which piece of our only outpost in interstellar space mattered least. Now think about what happens near the bottom. Instruments have gone one at a time, so the intuition is that everything else will go one at a time too. That intuition is wrong. Below a certain power level, you cannot heat the propellant lines and run the transmitter and keep the attitude control computer warm. Those are not independent items you retire in sequence. They are the conditions for each other. Lose heat and the thrusters seize, and you cannot hold the antenna on Earth. And the transmitter's remaining power stops mattering because it is aimed at nothing. The collapse arrives as a cluster, not a queue, and it is happening while the signal itself gets weaker. Received power falls with the square of distance, so every year the whisper we are straining to hear costs more to detect. 2 curves, bending toward each other. JPL estimates the spacecraft can keep operating into the early 2030s. That estimate assumes nothing else breaks. Something else is already breaking. The power curve is not what kills Voyager first, chemistry is. Voyager steers with tiny hydrazine thrusters that fire in short pulses, a few tens of milliseconds at a time, to keep the antenna pointed at Earth and the star tracker locked on its guide star. millions of those pulses over 5 decades, and every pulse leaves a trace of residue behind in the fuel line. The tubes are narrowing, slowly, from the inside, from deposits laid down by the spacecraft's own operation. What began as an opening a few hundredths of an inch across has been closing for years, and there is no procedure that reverses it. The team manages the problem by rotating between thruster sets, primary and backup, and the trajectory thrusters left over from the planetary flybys, spreading the damage rather than stopping it. That is not a spacecraft wearing out. That is an artery closing in a patient nobody can operate on. Now make it physical. If those lines close, Voyager cannot correct its role. If it cannot correct its role, the star tracker loses its reference. If the star tracker loses its reference, the 3.5-meter dish drifts off Earth. And a dish pointed slightly wrong at 25 billion kilometers is a dish pointed at nothing at all. The spacecraft does not die. It keeps working perfectly, warm, powered, transmitting, facing the wrong direction forever. You do not lose an instrument, you lose the aim. Those are different kinds of ending. And there is a second body in this story that gets mentioned less. The people. The Voyagers were designed by engineers who are now in their 80s, or gone. The code running on that spacecraft was written for hardware that predates the personal computer, in a system with less memory than a modern greeting card. The knowledge of how it actually behaves, the undocumented quirks, the reasons behind decisions made in 1976, lives in a small number of people, some of whom came back from retirement to work these problems. Not as consultants, as the only people left who could. When the November 2023 memory failure hit, part of the fix involved reading documentation written by people who had died decades earlier. There is something genuinely moving about that, and something quietly alarming. Every year the spacecraft gets more fragile, the response time gets longer, and the pool of humans who understand it gets smaller. 3 curves, all bending the same direction. None of this means the mission has been mismanaged. The opposite, honestly. It has been kept alive far past any reasonable expectation by people improvising against physics. But keeping one machine alive is not the same as having a capability. And that distinction is where this gets much worse. Ask a simple question. When Voyager 1 goes quiet, what replaces it? Nothing does. There is no funded mission designed to operate beyond the heliosphere. There have been studies. There is a well-developed concept for an interstellar probe discussed seriously in the planetary science community for years. It has no launch date, no approved budget, and no hardware. Now do the arithmetic on that gap, because the arithmetic is brutal. Voyager 1 needed 35 years to reach the boundary of the sun's bubble, and it only got there that fast because of a planetary alignment that happens roughly once every 176 years, which let it steal velocity from Jupiter and Saturn. That alignment is not coming back in your lifetime. Nothing we launch from here buys speed that cheaply again. Every future probe pays for it with propulsion, or with assists that give back far less. A new probe launched in the 2040s with better propulsion would still take decades to arrive. Approve one tomorrow, and the first fresh measurements from interstellar spaceland somewhere in the second half of this century. So the gap is not a pause, it is longer than most careers. A graduate student who wants to study that region with new in-place data is choosing a field whose next dataset arrives after they retire. And the infrastructure has its own arithmetic. The Deep Space Network is oversubscribed and has been for years. It supports missions across the solar system with a small number of large dishes, several of them decades old, and demand keeps climbing. The upgrades that took DSS-43 offline for 9 months were justified partly by the communications load coming from crewed lunar flights. That is a reasonable priority. It is also a straightforward competition, and one side of it is a 50-year-old probe returning readings from 2 remaining instruments, while the other side is astronauts. Say that plainly. Voyager is now competing for antenna time against the future of human spaceflight. using an antenna that has to be modernized for that future, in a network that cannot easily do both at once. None of this is a scandal. Budgets are finite, dishes are expensive, and the lunar program is not villainous for needing bandwidth. But the outcome does not care about intent. The outcome is that we are letting a unique capability lapse without a plan, on the assumption that it was always going to lapse anyway. Which raises an obvious question. If this is the shape of it, one dish, 4 watts a year, closing fuel lines, no successor, then why does almost everything you read about Voyager sound warm and reassuring? That is not an accident either. Listen closely to the vocabulary. The Voyagers get called senior citizens. They are described as still going strong, as beating the odds, as our farthest travellers. Coverage clusters around anniversaries and milestones. 50 years since launch arrives in September 2020, and you can already see the shape of that news cycle. Now put that language next to the operational record from the same period. A 5-month telemetry blackout, a forced fallback to 1981 era hardware, a 9-month command outage, thrusters revived at the risk of an explosion, instruments switched off in February 2025 and again in April 2026, leaving 2. Both descriptions are accurate. Only one of them is being amplified. I want to be careful here, because this is where this kind of story usually goes wrong. Nobody's lying. NASA publishes the status tables. The instrument shutdowns are announced. The thruster work was described honestly, including the risk. When the project manager says the team has been through downtime like this before and is preparing as much as it can, that is a true statement from someone who has earned the right to make it. There is no cover-up here, and I am not going to pretend there is. What there is a tone, and tone does work that facts do not. The affectionate register turns a decommissioning into a retirement. It converts a slow instrument-by-instrument shutdown into a dignified old age. It makes the eventual silence feel natural rather than chosen, and that framing is comfortable for everyone. It is comfortable for the agency, which does not have to explain why nothing replaced it. It is comfortable for reporters because a plucky survivor is a better story than a capability lapsing. And it is comfortable for us because we would rather feel fond than responsible. And there is a practical version of the same incentive underneath all of it. A mission winding down gracefully does not generate awkward questions in a budget hearing about why the follow-up was never funded. Watch how it works in practice. The light day crossing in November 2026 will be covered as a record. It is a record. It is also the moment the round-trip response time for any emergency reaches 48 hours, and that second sentence will appear far less often than the first. Here is the tell. Notice that almost every article about Voyager is about how long it has lasted, and almost none are about what happens after. The past tense is celebrated. The future tense is barely written. So strip the warmth off and ask the question the tone is protecting you from. When this stops, what specifically do we lose? The answer is much larger than one spacecraft. The sun blows a constant wind of charged particles outward in every direction, and that wind carves a bubble in the surrounding interstellar material. We live inside it. Everything here does. That bubble deflects a large fraction of the galactic cosmic rays that would otherwise reach us, and it is the outermost layer of shielding around this solar system. It is also the layer we understand worst. On August 25, 2012, Voyager 1 crossed the outer edge of it, at about 121.5 times the Earth-Sun distance. NASA did not confirm that crossing until September 2013, more than a year later, and the delay was not bureaucratic. The instrument that would have made the call directly, the plasma detector, had failed back in 1980. Confirmation eventually came from an unrelated instrument that measured oscillations in the surrounding plasma after a solar outburst rattled it. Competing papers in the literature had placed the crossing in different years. The record was genuinely contested. Then Voyager 2 crossed in November 2018 at about 119. Not the same distance. Different by a couple of astronomical units on a different trajectory at a different point in the solar cycle. So the boundary is not a sphere. It is asymmetric. It moves, it breathes with the sun's activity. And we know all of that from 2 crossings, ever, in the history of the species. 2. Both by spacecraft designed in the early 1970s for a completely different mission. Neither carried a working instrument built to study the thing they ended up defining. We found the edge of the solar system with leftovers. Now hold that against how confidently the heliosphere gets drawn. Every diagram you have seen of that bubble, every model of how well it shields us, every projection of what conditions a future crewed mission would face on a long transit, ultimately traces back to those 2 sets of in-place measurements and a lot of remote inference. Voyager is not a relic returning sentimental data. It is the calibration. It is the only thing standing between our models and the possibility that our models are wrong in ways we cannot detect. When it stops, the models do not stop. They keep producing numbers. They keep looking authoritative. They simply stop being checked against reality. And there is no mechanism to notice the drift. That is the actual loss, not a spacecraft, not a memory. We lose the ability to verify our understanding of the region. Our entire civilization sits inside, and we lose it for decades by default without anyone deciding to. Which brings this back to a date and a timestamp published to the second. November 18th, 2026, 2:16 and 7 seconds in the morning, Pacific time. Here is the full list of what that timestamp is standing on. 1 antenna in Australia that can send a command, and a maintenance calendar that decides when. 4 watts lost every year from a power supply that cannot be refilled. 2 working instruments out of 11. Hydrazine lines closing from the inside with no way to clear them. A pool of engineers who understand the machine getting smaller every year. A round-trip conversation time of 48 hours. And nothing built, funded, or scheduled to take its place. Put all of that together, and the milestone reads very differently. Voyager reaching 1 light day is not the mission's greatest achievement. It is the point where the distance finally outruns our ability to do anything about the distance. I want to say clearly what I am not arguing. I am not saying the mission failed. It returned the first close images of Jupiter and Saturn systems. It discovered volcanoes on Io. It crossed into interstellar space and told us the boundary was not where the models put it. And it has run for nearly half a century on a design that was supposed to last 4 years. I am not saying NASA lied because it did not. I am not saying the engineers made mistakes. They kept a 1970s machine alive across 170 astronomical units by improvising repeatedly at 2 days per attempt. I am saying the physical situation is harder than the affectionate language around it, and that we have quietly accepted a gap in our knowledge that will outlast most of the people reading about it. There is a narrow kind of hope in this, and it should come last. The magnetometer and the plasma wave subsystem are still returning data that nothing else on Earth or in space can produce, and every week that continues is a week of measurements we would otherwise never have. The 50th anniversary in September 2027 is genuinely reachable if the thrusters hold. And the golden record goes on regardless, indifferent to power levels, carrying whale song and back and a map of where we are, outward. For longer than the sun will exist, it will still be moving when everyone who built it is gone, and when the languages on that record have no speakers left, but the end will not be announced. There will be no final transmission, no last words, no clean moment anyone can point to afterward. It will be a scheduled contact on an ordinary morning at a dish in Canberra, where the operators listen at the appointed time, and nothing comes back.